Have you ever watched an arrogant fool walk into a powder keg with a lit torch just because he thought the dark looked inefficient? I held an entire multi-million-dollar system together, only to be fired by a guy in a $1,000 turtleneck wanting to impress investors with hollow tech buzzwords. He thought he cut dead weight. He actually cut his only parachute at 30,000 feet. Grab a black coffee. His ending is pure satisfaction. Hello and welcome back to Boss Revenge Stories. I want to sincerely thank you for your continuous support. But unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us with zero budget to operate. If you enjoyed today's story, please consider supporting us by joining our Patreon to listen to exclusive, true stories that are even better and much longer, featuring highly detailed situations we cannot publicize on YouTube, all brought to life by multiple emotional voice actors. You can join by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link in the video description or the pinned comment. Now, let us begin today's story, told from the perspective of our main character, Paisley Martin. I am 34 years old, and until very recently, I held the title of Senior Data Architect at Nebula Vault Systems. If you read the tech blogs, you would think Nebula Vault was the crown jewel of cloud data security and risk management in Austin, Texas. It is a place that desperately wants to be a miniature Silicon Valley. We had the sleek glass walls, the unlimited cold brew on tap, and a parking lot full of expensive electric cars. But the shiny exterior was nothing more than a carefully constructed illusion hiding a deeply rotting core. My actual job had absolutely nothing to do with the glamorous image the marketing department sold to the public. I do not speak in empty buzzwords or participate in team-building exercises. My daily reality consisted of writing relentless, grueling encryption scripts. I was the janitor of the digital realm, constantly sweeping up the messes and patching hundreds of critical security holes left behind by our bloated team of junior engineers. These kids were hired because they looked good on paper and worked for cheap. But they treated security protocols like optional suggestions. They built fragile sandcastles, and I was the one secretly pouring concrete over them so the tide would not wash us all away. Everyone else in that office lived in a blissful state of ignorance. They genuinely believed that our state-of-the-art automated systems were running perfectly smoothly on their own. They would saunter into the office at 9 a.m., grab their organic smoothies, and marvel at the green lights on their dashboard screens. What they never saw was the reality of my mornings. My alarm clock goes off at 4 a.m. every single day without fail. While my colleagues are fast asleep dreaming of their next promotion, I am sitting in the pitch black of my apartment, fighting off sophisticated cyber attacks and frantically stabilizing server infrastructure before the East Coast markets even open. By the time the company officially begins its workday, I have already averted 3 separate disasters. I was the invisible night watchman, bleeding myself dry to keep their fragile ecosystem intact. The people who actually mattered understood my value. Our biggest clients were multinational banks and massive healthcare organizations holding mountains of sensitive data. They flat out refused to deal with our account managers. They only trusted me, and they insisted on working directly with me. In a corporate culture built on faking it until you make it, I was the only person who told them the unfiltered truth about their data risks. I never beat around the bush. If a system was vulnerable, I told them exactly how bad it was and exactly how I was going to fix it. Management hated my bluntness, but the executives at those banks knew I was the only real shield they had. Because I knew exactly how incompetent the leadership at Nebula Vault was, I took extraordinary precautions. You do not survive in this industry by trusting the goodwill of executives. I meticulously archived every piece of technical evidence, backing up comprehensive system error logs, and keeping a strict record of every security warning I had raised that management chose to ignore. But my true safety net was something else entirely. Years before I ever walked through the doors of Nebula Vault, I developed and patented a highly advanced clean data routing algorithm. It was my personal masterpiece, built on my own time and with my own resources. It was entirely legal, ironclad, and completely independent of my employment contract. It belonged to me, 100%. Things were bad, but they were manageable until the board of directors decided the company needed a flashy new captain to attract more venture capital. That was when they brought in Preston Vance. Preston was our brand new chief executive officer, and he was a walking disaster dressed in a $1,000 turtleneck. He was the kind of man who spent more time rehearsing his poses for business magazine covers than he did trying to understand the basic coding languages our company relied on. Preston was a fanatic when it came to automated artificial intelligence. He threw the phrase into every conversation, using it as a magical cure for everything. He did not know the first thing about actual architecture, but he loved the sound of his own voice echoing in the boardroom. He was the lit torch walking into my powder keg. Preston Vance did not just join the company. He descended upon it like a tech evangelist armed with a slide presentation that cost more than my annual salary. His inaugural town hall meeting was a masterclass in the toxic fake it until you make it startup culture that has completely infected our industry. He paced the auditorium stage, wearing that absurdly expensive turtleneck, throwing out phrases like hyper-artificial intelligence scaling and breaking ecosystem boundaries. The junior developers ate it up, clapping and nodding along as if he were revealing the hidden secrets of the universe. I sat in the back row, translating his corporate poetry into reality. What he really meant was that he was about to gut our carefully built infrastructure to make the profit margins look prettier for the next fiscal quarter. His very first executive order was the swift and brutal elimination of my strict manual data review processes. He stood in front of the entire engineering department and called my protocols unnecessary bottlenecks. I called them the only things keeping us out of federal prison. But my voice was quickly drowned out by the applause of people who just wanted an easier workday. To enforce this new vision, Preston brought in his own right-hand man, a guy named Chadwick, who was immediately given the completely made-up title of Director of Artificial Intelligence Integration. Chadwick was a walking social media profile. His resume was a dazzling collection of high-level buzzwords, boasting about synergistic machine learning and dynamic neural networking. It took me exactly 3 minutes of watching him try to navigate his administrative terminal to realize the terrifying truth. The man could not write a single line of functional security code if his life depended on it. He was a fraud, wrapped in a designer fleece vest, pretending to be a visionary. The conflict between us escalated rapidly when I discovered that Chadwick planned to use a free, open-source artificial intelligence engine to process highly sensitive financial data from our banking clients. I triggered a system-wide red alert. I marched directly into Preston's office, bypassing his secretary, and laid out exactly how this reckless move would expose our clients to catastrophic data breaches. I fully expected him to panic. Instead, he leaned back in his ergonomic leather chair, steepled his fingers, and gave me a deeply condescending smile. "Paisley," he sighed, using that patronizing tone mediocre men reserve for women who know more than they do. "You are clinging to an old mindset. In the modern era, we move fast and break things. We cannot let legacy thinking stall our hyper-growth. Move fast and break things. The battle cry of the profoundly ignorant." After that meeting, I found my administrative privileges systematically stripped away. Chadwick was given the keys to the kingdom. He immediately began tampering with the core source code, deploying cheap, untested artificial intelligence tools to optimize processing speed. He treated the company's secure architecture like his personal sandbox. He was tearing down the reinforced steel walls I had built and replacing them with wet paper, all while patting himself on the back for increasing server speed by 15%. He was creating countless invisible data loopholes, massive vulnerabilities that would not show up on his flashy executive dashboards, but were ticking time bombs waiting to detonate under the weight of real-world traffic. The pinnacle of this absurdity arrived during the third quarter budget meeting. The boardroom was packed with executives, but all the oxygen was being consumed by one man, Marcus Thorne. Marcus was a legendary venture capitalist from New York, a man who built his massive empire by knowing exactly when to fund a company and when to completely gut it. He had a reputation as a corporate grim reaper. While Preston danced around the conference table, pointing at colorful, upward-trending graphs and spewing his usual garbage about artificial intelligence synergy. Marcus sat perfectly still. Marcus was a man of very few words, with eyes sharp enough to cut glass. I watched him closely from my seat, at the far end of the long mahogany table. He was not looking at the financial projections Preston was so desperately trying to sell to the room. He was looking at the underlying architecture reports. He was looking at the raw, unfiltered numbers, and then he looked directly at me. In that brief split second of eye contact, I knew Marcus Thorne was not buying a single word of Preston's performance. He saw right through the colorful charts and the $1,000 outfits. He knew the numbers were artificially inflated, and he was hunting for the absolute truth behind the facade. That was the exact moment my strategy changed. There is an old saying that you should never interrupt your enemy when he is making a fatal mistake. I decided it was time to stop arguing. I closed my laptop, folded my hands on the table, and embraced the silence. Let Preston have his grand stage. Let Chadwick deploy his catastrophic code. I was completely done trying to save people who were determined to drown themselves. Instead of fighting them, I began preparing for the inevitable flood. I spent my evenings meticulously backing up every single risk warning report, every ignored email, and every red alert I had sent to Preston and Chadwick. I created an encrypted, time-stamped archive, proving beyond any reasonable doubt that I had warned them about the exact vulnerabilities they were eagerly creating. More importantly, I contacted my legal team. I quietly paid a heavy retainer to have them update and bulletproof the patents for my proprietary clean data routing algorithm. I made absolutely certain that my personal intellectual property was completely insulated from the impending explosion at Nebula Vault Systems. I was no longer the invisible night watchman trying to protect their fragile glass house. I was the architect, calmly drawing up the blueprints for the fortress I would soon build directly on top of their ruins. Preston Vance was a man backed into a corner of his own making, though his massive ego completely shielded him from realizing it. As the new fiscal quarter rapidly approached, the financial pressure from the venture capital side intensified dramatically. Marcus Thorne had not written a check yet, and his prolonged silence was deafening to the executive team. Preston knew he needed a highly dramatic gesture to prove he was a ruthless, visionary optimizer. He needed to show he was a leader who was not afraid to trim the fat and aggressively modernize a bloated organizational chart. He desperately required a high-profile scapegoat to demonstrate his unwavering commitment to his automated integration strategy. I was the highest-paid architect on the payroll, and I was the only person in the building consistently telling him no. To a man like Preston, my relentless pragmatism was a personal insult. I was the perfect target. The ambush was meticulously set for late Friday afternoon, the classic corporate execution window designed to prevent terminated employees from making a scene. I received a cryptic calendar invite requesting my immediate presence in the main glass boardroom. When I walked in, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. The entire executive board was seated rigidly around the massive table, their expressions carefully blank. Marcus Thorne was present as well, sitting completely silently in the far corner of the room, his sharp eyes evaluating the changing dynamics. Preston stood proudly at the head of the table, puffing his chest out. He was wearing a dark, custom-tailored suit instead of his usual turtleneck, presumably to look like a serious, heavy-handed executioner. He did not even offer me a seat. He immediately launched into a heavily rehearsed, theatrical speech about streamlining critical operations, maximizing shareholder value, and aggressively pivoting toward a fully automated future. He paced back and forth across the thick carpet, gesturing wildly with his hands, before finally stopping and turning his deeply condescending gaze directly on me. "Paisley," he said, his voice dripping with a sickeningly fake sympathy, "we are moving the company in a bold direction that requires lean, agile engineering. Your manual oversight protocols are severely slowing down our deployment pipelines. Frankly, your position has become the redundancy of the old tech era. We are terminating your employment, effective immediately." He paused, clearly waiting for the emotional explosion. He wanted shock. He wanted bitter anger. He desperately wanted me to beg for my job or shout in frustration so he could look like the rational, composed leader expertly handling a hysterical employee in front of Marcus Thorne. Instead, I felt an overwhelming, profound sense of peace wash over me. The hurricane I had been preparing for had finally arrived, and I was the only person in the room holding a reinforced steel umbrella. I looked him dead in the eye and offered a soft, genuinely gentle smile. It was the exact kind of pitying smile you give a stubborn child who has confidently shouted the wrong answer to a simple math problem. "I completely understand. Preston," I replied calmly. My voice was perfectly steady, betraying absolutely zero emotion or weakness. If the company is fully committing to Chadwick's automated integration process, my manual architecture is indeed unnecessary. I have fully anticipated this transition. I reached into my leather portfolio and pulled out a single, neatly typed sheet of paper. I slid it across the smooth mahogany table until it rested directly in front of him. "This is a standard separation and handover agreement," I explained, keeping my tone perfectly measured and professional. "It formally transitions all my internal project files and administrative documentation to Chadwick. It also explicitly states that Nebula Vault Systems formally relinquishes any and all usage rights to external, non-contract algorithms that I brought into the environment to temporarily stabilize the legacy systems. It is just standard legal housekeeping for a clean, mutual break." Preston scoffed, incredibly eager to look decisive and dominant in front of his board of directors and the silent venture capitalist watching from the corner. He did not bother to read the fine print. He did not ask his corporate legal counsel, who was sitting right next to him, to review the document. He simply snatched a heavy, gold-plated pen from the table and aggressively scribbled his signature at the bottom of the page. He genuinely thought he was carelessly dismissing a minor nuisance. He had absolutely no idea that he had just legally signed away the absolute core of his company's security infrastructure. "Thank you," I said, swiftly retrieving the signed document and sliding it safely back into my portfolio. "I will have my desk completely cleared in 30 minutes. I turned on my heel and walked out of the glass boardroom without a single backward glance. I did exactly as I promised. I walked back to my workstation, grabbed my winter coat, and took absolutely nothing but a single, heavily encrypted USB drive from my locked drawer. That incredibly small piece of hardware contained the legal proof of my intellectual property, the flawless clean data routing algorithm that was now entirely legally mine again. The very moment the heavy glass doors of the Nebula Vault building slid shut behind me, I stopped on the concrete sidewalk. I pulled out my secure mobile terminal. With 3 precise, deliberate taps on the glass screen, I accessed my private administrator console and systematically revoked every single API key tied to my personal developer account. Those were the digital keys that allowed my proprietary code to quietly run in the background, constantly patching the massive, gaping holes Chadwick and his junior team were eagerly creating. In 1 second, I permanently severed the invisible life support system keeping the company alive. By 8 o'clock that evening, night had fully descended upon the city. I was sitting comfortably in the quiet, dim sanctuary of my apartment. I had changed into soft lounge clothes, opened a bottle of very expensive red wine I had been saving for a special occasion, and poured myself a generous glass. I booted up my personal computer and opened a secure, custom-built dashboard displaying public network traffic and server response latency across the tech sector. There was no immediate explosion. Corporate networks are massive cargo ships. They take a moment to realize they have struck an iceberg, but the protective shielding was officially gone. The raw, unfiltered financial data of a dozen major banking institutions was now being aggressively chewed up by Chadwick's cheap, unchecked automated tools. I took a slow, deep sip of the rich, dark wine, letting the complex flavors settle on my tongue. I leaned back in my chair and stared intently at the steady green lines on my glowing monitor, knowing exactly the kind of unprecedented chaos that was coming. The countdown game had officially begun. It took exactly 3 days for the glittering illusion to shatter completely. Exactly 72 hours after I walked out of that glass building, the brilliant, highly optimized artificial intelligence algorithm implemented by Chadwick began to actively cannibalize the network. His integration tool did exactly what it was blindly programmed to do. It moved fast. Unfortunately, it completely lacked the ability to comprehend context or secure boundaries. By Tuesday morning, the automated system had systematically misclassified millions of highly sensitive financial data files. It was taking confidential corporate merger documents and dumping them into public-facing cloud directories. It was stripping the heavy encryption off personal client portfolios and scrambling their access permissions across entirely unrelated server farms. The phones at Nebula Vault Systems did not just ring. They erupted in a unified chorus of absolute disaster. The switchboards lit up with priority calls from our largest partner banks. These were institutions that managed billions of dollars in client assets, and they were suddenly experiencing catastrophic, highly visible data leaks in real time. Their internal compliance officers were not just angry, they were screaming about federal security regulation breaches. They explicitly cited massive, unforgivable violations of the Securities and Exchange Commission mandates. The banks were legally obligated to report these breaches, meaning the disaster was about to become public knowledge. Inside the walls of the Austin office, absolute, unadulterated panic had taken over. I watched the public traffic spikes from my home monitor, easily picturing the scene. Preston was undoubtedly pacing the floors, demanding immediate solutions and shouting at his executive team to fix a problem he did not even possess the vocabulary to understand. Chadwick, sweating profusely in his designer vest, was desperately digging through the core server repositories trying to find a manual override to stop the bleeding. But there was no override to be found. Chadwick kept digging deeper and deeper into the digital foundation, looking for the heavy encryption shield that usually absorbed these types of catastrophic routing errors. He finally reached the absolute bottom of the architecture and found nothing but empty, echoing space. The realization must have hit him like a physical blow. The core system was completely hollow. The ironclad safety net was permanently gone, entirely removed by the network command I had executed on my way out the door. It was a perfectly legal withdrawal, authorized by the binding document Preston had so eagerly signed to prove his dominance. The corporate environment instantly devolved into a vicious, feral blame game. Preston cornered Chadwick in the main glass hallway, furiously screaming that the new artificial intelligence integration was a complete disaster and demanding to know why the system was failing. Chadwick, terrified of losing his lucrative salary and his industry reputation, desperately tried to deflect the blame. He stammered out pathetic, nonsensical excuses about unprecedented hardware failures and unexpected server load anomalies. But the massive banking clients did not care about their internal bickering or their empty technical excuses. That very night, our absolute largest client, a multinational financial powerhouse, formally terminated their $15 million annual contract. They did not just cancel the agreement, they sent a brutal notice of intent to sue for gross negligence, demanding massive financial compensation for the regulatory fines they were about to incur. Meanwhile, I was sitting peacefully on my velvet sofa, watching my personal cell phone light up continuously. The barrage of communication was relentless. My inbox was flooding with frantic, capitalized emails from the junior engineering team who had suddenly realized their automated tools were completely useless. Text messages were pouring in from project managers who used to ignore me in the break room. "Paisley, please, the entire routing matrix is corrupted. We cannot find your backup scripts." "Paisley, Preston is threatening to fire all of us. The system is bleeding client data. Please answer the phone." I picked up the device, unlocked the bright screen, and slowly scrolled through the endless stream of pure, unadulterated desperation. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or guilt. I slowly tapped the screen, opening every single message just long enough to trigger the read receipt. I wanted them to look at their screens and see the tiny notification confirming that I had read their desperate pleas. Then, I set the phone face down on the coffee table and enjoyed the absolute silence of my living room. I did not reply to a single one. By Thursday morning, Preston was completely out of options, bleeding capital, and entirely out of his mind. In a blind, desperate rage, he decided to use his last remaining weapon. He ordered his highly paid corporate legal team to aggressively go after me. A courier arrived at my apartment building, delivering a massive, thick envelope containing a terrifyingly worded cease and desist letter. The document was a masterpiece of aggressive corporate bullying. It formally accused me of malicious corporate sabotage, unauthorized deletion of critical company assets, and intentional destruction of private intellectual property. They threatened me with massive federal lawsuits, criminal charges, and total financial ruin if I did not immediately return to the office, surrender my administrative keys, and restore the corrupted systems to their original state. I did not panic. I did not even bother to call my own lawyer. I walked over to my home printer and scanned the heavily stamped legal threat into my computer. Then, I drafted a very short, incredibly simple email directed to the lead partner of the Nebula Vault legal department, making absolutely certain to copy Preston Vance directly on the chain. I attached a high-resolution scanned copy of the separation and handover agreement. I specifically highlighted Preston's bold, sloppy signature at the bottom of the page in bright yellow. Below the attachment, I typed a single, devastating paragraph. As per the mutually executed legal agreement attached, signed voluntarily by your Chief Executive Officer, Nebula Vault Systems explicitly waived any and all rights to the proprietary clean data routing algorithms formerly keeping your legacy systems operational. Furthermore, any attempt to compel me to surrender my legally owned personal intellectual property or perform unpaid labor under the threat of litigation constitutes severe harassment and extortion. To ensure they fully understood the gravity of their mistake, I added a direct citation from the Federal Legal Code regarding intellectual property extortion and malicious prosecution. I hit send. The result was instantaneous and incredibly satisfying. The furious, threatening emails stopped entirely. The frantic phone calls ceased. The entire legal department of Nebula Vault Systems was immediately paralyzed by the cold, hard reality of the situation. They realized their own arrogant boss had legally handed me the detonator to their company, and any further action against me would only expose his monumental incompetence to the public record. The paper empire was rapidly burning to the ground, and the executives inside were finally realizing that the exits were firmly locked from the outside. The morning after I completely neutered Nebula Vault's legal department, my private phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. The caller identification simply read as an unknown number. I let it ring twice, fully expecting it to be Preston attempting to bypass the legal blockade to beg me personally. I picked up the device and answered with a cold, flat greeting. The voice on the other end did not belong to a frantic, sweating executive. It was calm, rich, and carried an undeniable weight of authority. "Miss Martin," the man said smoothly, "this is Marcus Thorne. I believe we have a conversation long overdue." I stood perfectly still. The legendary venture capitalist from New York was calling me directly. "I am listening, Marcus," I replied, keeping my tone carefully measured. He did not waste a single breath on pleasantries. He instructed me to meet him at a highly exclusive, private club disguised as an unassuming coffee shop tucked away in the historic district of the city. 2 hours later, I walked into the dimly lit, mahogany-paneled room. Marcus was already seated in a heavy leather booth in the far corner, a cup of black coffee resting untouched in front of him. He looked exactly as he had in the boardroom, sharp, calculating, and entirely unbothered by the absolute chaos erupting across the tech sector. I slid into the booth across from him. He folded his hands and looked at me with an expression of deep, clinical fascination. "Let us skip the corporate theater. Paisley," Marcus began, his voice barely rising above a low murmur. I knew Preston Vance was a complete fraud. The absolute second he opened his mouth about artificial intelligence synergy, the man is an empty suit. He could not successfully manage a lemonade stand, let alone a cloud security infrastructure. I raised an eyebrow. If you knew he was driving the company off a cliff, why did you let him take the wheel? You sat in that boardroom and watched him sign the execution order. Marcus leaned forward, the shadows catching the sharp angles of his face. Because I needed a massive, undeniable system shock. The current board of directors at Nebula Vault is a collection of weak, complacent puppets. If I simply tried to vote them out, they would have fought me in court for years. I needed them to fail spectacularly. I needed a disaster so catastrophic that it would completely paralyze the leadership and drop the valuation of the company straight through the floor. Preston was incredibly eager to light the match. And you, my dear, provided the perfect amount of gasoline by taking away the safety net. It was a brilliant, ruthless strategy. He had allowed a fool to destroy a multi-million-dollar enterprise just to clear the board. Now, Marcus continued, his eyes narrowing slightly, let us talk about the real reason I called you here. The algorithm. The clean data routing protocol you took with you when you walked out. The architecture that is currently missing and causing absolute panic on Wall Street. He expected me to give him a technical breakdown. He expected me to pitch him a piece of software. Instead, I reached into my leather bag and pulled out a thick, beautifully bound portfolio. I placed it squarely on the table between us. I am not interested in selling you a piece of code. Marcus, I said, my voice ringing with absolute certainty. I designed that algorithm long before I ever met Preston, but 6 months ago, when I realized Nebula Vault was unsalvageable, I started designing something much bigger. I opened the portfolio. Inside was a comprehensive, legally vetted, fully operational business plan for an entirely new data security firm. I had mapped out the entire corporate structure, the server acquisition strategies, the compliance protocols, and the targeted marketing campaigns. It was a complete, ready-made enterprise waiting for oxygen. Marcus slowly flipped through the pages, his silence stretching for several long minutes. I could see the gears turning in his brilliant mind. When he finally looked up, there was a genuine, predatory spark in his eyes. This is not just a lifeboat, he whispered, almost in awe. This is a warship. Exactly, I replied. You do not want to just invest in a startup. You want to build an apex predator, right now. There are dozens of massive financial institutions desperately fleeing the wreckage of Nebula Vault. They are bleeding data. They are facing federal fines, and they are absolutely terrified. We are going to offer them the only sanctuary in the market. Marcus smiled. It was a terrifying, beautiful sight. We become the shark. We swallow their entire client base whole. On my terms, I countered immediately, leaning in to close the trap. If we do this, I retain exactly 60% equity, I hold absolute operational control and the final decision-making power. I will not have another board of directors trying to replace my concrete walls with paper mache. And my very first objective, once we are operational, is to aggressively buy the remaining ashes of Nebula Vault systems for pennies on the dollar. I watched him closely, waiting for the inevitable negotiation. Venture capitalists never give away a majority stake without a brutal fight. But Marcus Thorne simply reached into his tailored jacket, pulled out a silver pen, and placed it on top of my business plan. 60% is yours. He agreed without a single second of hesitation. You build the fortress, and I will fund the war. Over the next 14 days, the contrast between the two worlds was absolutely staggering. While Preston Vance was drowning in a swamp of aggressive federal investigations, frantically hiding from relentless financial journalists, and desperately trying to keep his remaining executives from testifying against him, I was operating in total, lethal silence. Marcus and I moved with terrifying speed. We quietly secured a massive, state-of-the-art server facility outside the city limits. We expedited the federal compliance paperwork through Marcus's elite legal connections. We finalized the corporate charter and locked in the proprietary patents under a brand new banner. While Nebula Vault Systems was suffocating in the dark, we successfully, quietly breathed life into a new empire. We named the security company Aegis Prime. The board was set, the pieces were in place, and it was finally time to corner the king. The emergency board meeting was convened on a dreary Wednesday morning. The atmosphere inside the grand glass boardroom of Nebula Vault Systems was suffocating, thick with the stench of pure desperation. At the head of the long mahogany table stood Preston Vance. The transformation he had undergone in just a few short weeks was absolutely staggering. He was no longer the sleek, arrogant visionary posing for business magazine covers. His designer turtleneck was completely gone, replaced by a rumpled dress shirt with dark sweat stains blooming under the arms. His face was pale, his skin drawn tight, and his eyes heavily bagged from countless sleepless nights spent dodging calls from furious federal regulators and aggressive investigative journalists. Yet, despite the undeniable reality that his company was rapidly sinking into oblivion, his massive ego refused to let him surrender gracefully. He was desperately clinging to a slide projector, attempting to present a completely fabricated restructuring plan to his terrified board of directors. He needed capital, and he needed it immediately. He was banking entirely on Marcus Thorne arriving to deliver a massive financial bailout. I listened closely through the slightly ajar door as Preston paced frantically, waving his hands in a disjointed rhythm. "Gentlemen, what we are currently experiencing is nothing more than a minor technical glitch," he lied, his voice cracking slightly under the immense pressure. "The automated integration is merely experiencing standard growing pains. We have the situation entirely under control. The data anomaly is completely isolated. All we require is a short-term emergency bridge loan from our partners to weather this brief public relations storm, and our artificial intelligence infrastructure will propel us to unprecedented market dominance by the fourth quarter." It was a pathetic, deeply delusional performance. The board members sat in stunned silence, clearly doubting every single word spilling from his mouth, yet silently praying he was right, because their own fortunes were tied to his sinking ship. They were desperately waiting for a savior. Instead, they got the executioner. Marcus Thorne reached out and forcefully pushed the heavy glass doors open. They swung wide with a loud, resounding crack that echoed sharply through the tense room. Every head at the mahogany table snapped toward the entrance. Marcus strode into the boardroom with the chilling, undeniable presence of an apex predator claiming its territory. But the true, devastating shockwave hit the room when I stepped in right behind him. I was no longer the invisible night watchman hiding behind a glowing monitor in the early hours of the morning. I was wearing a meticulously tailored, razor-sharp designer suit, my posture radiating absolute, unbreakable authority. I walked in with the calm, terrifying certainty of a woman who held the ultimate fate of every single person in that room directly in the palm of her hand. Preston completely froze. The digital laser pointer slipped from his trembling fingers and clattered loudly onto the polished wood table. His mouth opened and closed several times before he finally managed to form a coherent sentence. "What is she doing here?" he demanded, his voice pitching upward in sheer panic. He pointed a shaking finger directly at me. "Security. Someone call security right now and have this disgruntled former employee removed from the premises immediately." Before anyone could even reach for a telephone, Marcus raised a single, commanding hand. The entire room instantly fell into a dead, suffocating silence. Marcus walked calmly to the center of the table and dropped a thick, heavily bound stack of legal documents right in front of the terrified board chairman. "There will be no bridge loan, Preston," Marcus stated, his voice ringing with absolute brutal finality. "That document is the formal, irrevocable withdrawal of all my investment capital from Nebula Vault Systems. You are financially terminated." The color completely drained from Preston's face, leaving him looking like a ghost. The board members erupted into a chaotic chorus of panicked whispers and frantic questions. But the slaughter was only just beginning. Marcus turned to the terrified executives and delivered the lethal blow. "I am not withdrawing my capital from the data security sector," Marcus clarified, a ruthless, calculating smile playing on his lips. "I have simply reallocated it. Yesterday morning, I fully funded the launch of Aegis Prime, the most advanced corporate security firm on the market, and I would like to formally introduce you to its chief executive officer." He gestured gracefully toward me. I stepped forward, holding my own pristine leather folder. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. True power is perfectly quiet. I pulled out a single sheet of premium paper and let it flutter down onto the table, landing right next to Marcus's withdrawal documents. That, I said smoothly, letting my eyes lock onto Preston, is a comprehensive list of the 5 largest banking institutions in the country, your 5 largest clients, or rather, they were your clients. I watched Preston's eyes dart frantically over the printed list. I watched his soul completely leave his body as comprehension dawned on him. As of 8 o'clock this morning, I continued, savoring every single syllable of his destruction. All 5 of those financial powerhouses officially terminated their contracts with Nebula Vault Systems. They have exclusively signed multi-year agreements with Aegis Prime. They moved their billions of dollars in assets because my architecture is the only system in the entire industry that currently meets the strict federal security mandates you so carelessly chose to violate. Preston staggered backward, his knees visibly buckling until he collapsed heavily into his ergonomic leather chair. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of absolute terror and utter disbelief. He was totally broken, violently stripped of his hollow buzzwords and his entirely unearned arrogance. I leaned forward, resting both my hands flat on the cool mahogany table, bringing my face just inches from his sweating forehead. I looked directly into his defeated eyes and recalled the exact moment he thought he had effortlessly destroyed my career. "Do you remember what you called me, Preston?" I asked, my voice a soft, lethal whisper echoing through the dead silent boardroom. "You stood in this exact room and called my work the redundancy of the old tech era. You thought you were making a bold, visionary move to impress the room." I offered him the exact same gentle, pitying smile I had given him on the day he fired me. "You did not fire an employee, Preston. You fired the entire core value of your company, and now you have absolutely nothing left." The boardroom instantly descended into absolute bedlam. The chairman of the board immediately slammed his fist on the table, loudly calling for an emergency vote to permanently terminate Preston Vance with extreme prejudice. Another senior executive was already shouting into his mobile phone, ordering the legal department to immediately freeze all of Preston's corporate assets and prepare for an exhaustive internal fraud investigation. We did not stay to watch the rest of the bloodbath. Our work was completely finished. I turned around and walked out of the glass boardroom side by side with Marcus. We walked down the long, bright corridors of Nebula Vault Systems for the very last time, leaving the burning wreckage of the paper empire far behind us. I stepped out of the massive building and into the crisp, bright morning air. A sleek black town car was waiting patiently by the curb to take me to the corner executive office of my brand new company. As I slid into the luxurious leather seat and the driver pulled away from the curb, I felt a profound, undeniable sense of total victory. The corporate world is heavily populated with hollow men eagerly selling empty promises. But true, unshakable power never lies in flashy presentations or meaningless buzzwords. It lies entirely in the hands of the quiet people who actually know how to write the source code that builds the world. Thank you so very much for taking the time to listen to this story today. I would absolutely love to know where you are tuning in from. So please let me know your city and country in the comments below. If you enjoyed today's journey and want to support our work, please consider joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon community. There, you can listen to our very best, highly detailed exclusive true stories that we simply cannot publicize on YouTube. You can easily join by scanning the QR code currently on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link provided in the video description and the pinned comment. Thank you again, and have a wonderful day.